Hello. Okay.
Hello, hello.
Hi. Let's get everybody. Oh no, we have a rooster crowing for us.
Okay, beautiful. Now I see you on
Mhm.
the stream.
Hello, how are you? Nice to
Okay.
meet you. Tansi,
Great.
Tansi. Anin Washai. That means welcome, welcome, welcome. So good to see you. Come on in. In my own language, which is Cree.
Beautiful.
Okay. Everybody, if you come on in, this is someone you've been waiting a few days for, Professor Arash Azizi at New York University. Uh, Historian, author, correspondent. So excited he agreed to jump on with us with 2 days' notice. Unbelievable. We're going to talk about his book, The Shadow Commander. Beautifully written. It reads like a screenplay. It's like watching a movie. Gorgeous book. I've asked him to speak about Palestine and Israel, Iran's role, and with a certain context. There's a lot of narrative about indigenous occupation, settler colonialism showing up in the narrative. Professor Azizi is going to help us understand what's going on. And we're going to first find out a lot about him, and then we're going to go right on into it. He has agreed to allow certain streamers, content creators, later on, if you would like to panel with him and have a conversation with him, you let me know from chat. Mods, get your swords out. And we're going to go right into this. So thank you so much. You came on very short notice. I found you because of a Twitter thread
Mhm.
that you had written. One of the other streamers who's very well respected here seemed to have a problem with something that you said. I actually wasn't sure. It made me open the thread. I read every single word. By the time I got to the last post, I immediately contacted you and I just said, "What you're saying? Could you come on my show and say it?" It's that easy, or that simple. So this is he says yes, and so here we are. So I'd like to first let my community get to know you. They know you're important. That's how they feel, but they don't know who you are. Is it okay if you gave us just a little story about you, who you are, where you're from, what brought you into the work that you've done, and where you're teaching, and then your further goals? And then I'm just going to let you go ahead and teach us everything you can and say everything you want to say. And that
Of
easy.
course. Yeah, no, thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me. So my name is Arash Azizi. I am from Iran. I'm born and raised in Tehran. Tehran is the capital of Iran, as you mostly know. I was born in 1988, toward the end of the Iran-Iraq War. I have to say, when the recent bombings are happening in Palestine and Israel, I am reminded of the fact that when I was coming toward my mom, when my mom was pregnant with me, Tehran was attacked by missiles, so she had to always hide in the bomb shelters. So
Mm.
unfortunately, the stories of the Middle East wars are never far from us. In that war of Iran and Iraq, I lost a cousin, and almost every Iranian family lost someone. So it's just a reminder that in biographies, all of us, there's always this sort of war and conflict, unfortunately, that's been part of the Middle Eastern societies for quite some time now. So yeah, I'm from Iran, and I've lived in different places in my life. I've been a socialist activist most of my adult life, and some of the not so adult life. Since my I think I identify as a Marxist since I was um, 15 or 16 years old, and I was part of a communist organization in Iran. And then I've joined different organizations throughout the years. And I love history. I've always had a passion and love for history, and right now I'm finishing. I'm the towards the end of finishing my PhD at NYU, and I teach at NYU and at different. I've taught at different places. I've also guest lectured before at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem in Israel, and I've sort of guest lectured here and there in different places in the United States, in the UK, and other countries. And I guess that's my story mostly, and I my research is mostly, let's say, I'll call it an emancipatory movements in the Middle East. Specifically, I mean, if you want to get technical, I work on the Cold War era, 1960s and 70s, between Iranian and Arabs. So a lot of Iranian-Palestinian solidarity, sort of that kind of history. Um, but in general, I'm always interested in emancipatory movements and sort of anti-capitalist movements, and how we can make the world a better place and sort of throw off the chains of oppression. So that's sort of my background, and yeah,
They're gonna love you. This is a real Marxist. How about that?
I try.
Anti-capitalist. The Twitch audience is going to ask you this. I'll ask ahead of time. They will say, if you're an anti-capitalist, are you an anarchist or not?
And no, I'm not an anarchist. So I think Marxism and anarchism have been two sort of broad tenets, if you will, in anti-capitalism. Um, I identify with a lot. I mean, I think anarchists can be great comrades, and they always, they often have been sometimes. But I don't identify as anarchist because, and actually, so I mean, if on the question of a state that has been the main sort of dividing line, if you will, I think it's something even broader than just like labels of anarchism or not. I think the experience shows that on the left, we usually hate the state, right? We've sort of hated the state as a tool of oppression, and that's right. But I think the experience has shown that what we need are democratic states,
Mm-hmm.
and democratizing the state,
Mm-hmm.
not just getting rid of the state, which I hope one day maybe we can live in a civilization where there is no such a state of authority. But I think the reality has shown that for now, what we need to do is democratize the state structures
Mm-hmm.
and how we relate to each other. Just
Mm-hmm.
like how you need moderators on
Mm-hmm.
this chat.
Just like how you need
I think that's
moderators. Exactly. Totally.
exactly.
Maybe you can answer one of the points of contention. This is just simple Twitch community stuff. Um,
Mhm.
is socialism dependent on democracy? Yes or no? These are
Well,
my
look, I think.
students asking these, and I'm like, hold on. I will ask him what he thinks. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm cool. We can talk whatever you want. I'm here
Just,
to
just
talk and to
quickly, and
share.
then we go on to what matters. But I'm trying to ask these before they do, so they can ask better
Yeah, no,
questions later.
definitely, definitely. Look, I think socialism. I think Karl Marx. It was Karl Marx who said communism is the democratization of everything, or something like that. He
Yes.
has a quote like that. So for me, it's basically democracy, socialism, and communism are sort of part of the same really question. It's basically the question of how can human beings have control over their lives.
Mm-hmm.
That's really what it's always been about for me since I was a young Marxist in Iran, and yeah. So I think socialism is democratic or nothing. But I think these are broad sort of we
Wow.
talk about. I think one thing that is key in this kind of discussion is that we talk about broad philosophical terms, but then we also gotta get to a specifics, right? A specific meaning of democracy is that people should be able to pick who's their executive, and in the United States, we do that. That's a limited meaning of democracy, but it's very important because in my country, Iran, you don't do that, but in the United States, you do that. You pick who's in the legislature and you pick who runs the government. I think that's very in relatively free and fair elections. And I think yes, that is definitely very important. And any yeah, so it's inseparable from a socialist vision to be able to elect who's gonna run the state that we just talked about, right?
Wow. There you go. Now you have it. No more arguing. It's inseparable. Okay.
There we go.
Can you tell us a little briefly what is being a Marxist like in Iran?
So Iran has a very repressive system, and it has also a specifically anti-communist system from the
Yeah.
beginning. There's the Islamic Republic. The Islamic Republic was founded in 1979 following a revolution, and one of the first thing that it did was massacring actually a lot of Marxists and
Yeah.
executing thousands of Marxists in the
Yeah.
1980s.
Yeah.
So it continued to heavily repress Marxism, and I was also arrested in Iran along with many of the comrades. And yeah, unfortunately, being a Marxist in Iran means having to deal with heavy state repression.
How did you what were you put into jail or how did you get out of being arrested, or what? Can you talk
I
about
no,
it?
I was only shortly detained and I had to come out. But I mean, much more important than me are many Iranian Marxist and labor activists who've spent really long
Long time.
times in prison and different times.
True. There's also oppression of the press, and then you have the situation I heard you speak of. A young girl was arrested
Yeah.
10 years for. Do you want to tell chat about her with the Amnesty International? So she's one of our cases and
To be
also
honest,
freedom. Hmm.
to be honest, I don't actually remember which one you mean. Thankfully, I say thankfully, sort of in a dark comedy way. We have every day so many cases of men and women being sent to jail that I don't know which particular one you're talking about. But at any given time, there are thousands of political prisoners in Iran, and there's a thing called Iran Prison Atlas. If you Google that, you can go and see sort of about so many of the prisoners. My own father is one of the sort of examples that I remember the best. My own father was in prison for about 2 years, and he came out about a couple of years ago. But unfortunately, Iranian prisons are always full of political prisoners.
Yeah, dissidents, or they say defamation of the state. So as a journalist for chat, when I was getting ready to go, I was involved with the Myanmar Rohingya situation
Yeah.
and Syria, and getting ready to go overseas, except for COVID hit. Okay, fine. But they give us a very detailed training on what we can and cannot say, and period, and defamation of the state, especially for all Middle Eastern countries. No, you cannot just go say what you want to about someone's state, especially not a foreign country. So when citizens use social media or music, this is especially threatening to many very fundamentalist states, what they think is immorality or sedition. Even if you post social media with a little, video or photo, and they take it a little too personally, or they think, hey, we don't like the way you're representing your nation. That's it, and that's it. They come in. That's it. They arrest you. There's a young woman who was, I believe, shot in a public square in her car. Um, Appreciate your freedoms that you say you don't have, because you do have them. So I want all of you to hear what it's really like outside of the space that you live in and take for granted. I will chastise you for that. Okay, thank you for that. I just want you to go ahead and say what you were saying on that thread that grabbed me instantly, especially if you can talk about this terminology, settler colonialism and indigenous occupation, showing up in this context. And I'm just going to let you go ahead and talk to the chat. I will field their questions. Then, whenever you're ready, we can have a few can join us later. But we're just going to let you take the floor completely. I have a storm coming. If the stream goes down, will you just stay there in Discord? The chat may come and join us if we can't get it back up, and we will just continue on Discord. Okay, so don't worry about it. If the stream goes down, ignore it. We'll just be here with you in Discord, and we'll just keep going. Okay, thank you. Okay, here you have Professor Arash Azizi. He's just going to tell you what he thinks and what he knows. Get your questions ready. Good faith only. The moderators have heavy swords. You know the drill here. Disrespect my guest in my house, and you're no longer welcome. Bye, Felicia. Okay, go ahead. Take it away.
Definitely, definitely. But yeah, of course, disrespect is never good. But I welcome all questions and challenges, and I hope we can talk about it. So, yeah. So what I tried to say on the thread was, the question of Palestine, and Palestine, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, in some ways, it's very simple, and I actually appreciate it when people say, "Look, it's not complicated. At some point, it's simple." What's the simple part? The simple part is millions of people, Palestinians, in the West Bank and Gaza, are living under military occupation. This is unique. In no other place in the world, you have a population of millions living as a stateless under military occupation of another state. We have many other problems. We can talk about the Uyghurs in China, we can talk about the repression in Iran, we can talk about Kurds in Turkey, we can talk about a lot of things. But there's no other population in the world like the Palestinians who have to live as a stateless citizens under military occupation. What does it mean to be a stateless people under military occupation? It means that you have to pass through checkpoints wherever you want to go. It means that you have no access to airport without having to go through Israel. And of course, there are actually Palestinian passports that some countries sort of accept, but citizens are stateless because Palestine is not an official state, is not a member of the UN, and more importantly, you can't go through without going through Israeli airports anyway. So this is simple. There are millions of people living under this brutal occupation. Now, in the West Bank, I spoke about checkpoints. In Gaza, they have to live under a siege. A siege that has been going on for many years, and Gaza is one of the worst places on the planet to be, really. It's an open-air prison held by Israel. It's a very small strip of land sandwiched between Israel and Egypt by the Mediterranean. It used to be a beautiful place. It used to be a place where, if you listen to old people who traveled there, it had the best oranges, it has wonderful strawberries, it has a great sort of popular traditions, but unfortunately it's now kept an open air prison under siege and also ruled by a brutal repressive Islamist group called Hamas, and as I said, under siege by Israel and repeatedly under attack by Israel, including in the last, since Monday, more than 100 people and more than 30 children have died in attacks by Israel. And in Israel itself, due to Hamas's rocket attacks on civilians, 7 or 8 people have also died there. So this part is simple. Now, what is not simple is that how this situation came to be, of course. And we can talk about the history of it. We can talk about the history since 1947, 1948, even longer, since 1881, when the Zionist movement began, and which Jews started settling in Palestine. And as the conversation goes, we can talk about it. We can talk about the parts that we want. But the important thing to remember here is this, and that's what I try to say in the thread. Politics is difficult because human beings have different visions and disagreements, genuine disagreements about the spaces that they're in. And because people are born into structures that their parents built. And, in politics, wherever you cannot never turn the clock back, right? You cannot just go back. So you need to start from where you are. Now, what is the reality of Palestine and Israel that is important to remember in all discussions of this place? And we'll get to settler colonialism and indigenous struggle that the theme that came up, and I also wrote about it there. And how is it relevant and how is it not relevant? The reality is this: there are two general national communities living in Israel-Palestine. There are also people a little outside this group, but 99% are two national communities living in this little space called Israel-Palestine. And these are Jews, Israeli Jews, who are citizens of Israel and who are Jewish, and there are Palestinians. Now, some of these Palestinians are citizens of Israel, some of them are stateless peoples in West Bank or Gaza. Now, some of these people are not stateless. They have citizenship of Jordan or other countries, mostly Jordan, but majority of stateless. So two national communities. This is important. These are not a small number of people. There are millions of people, right? Both of them. There are, we can check the actual numbers, but something like 7 million, 7 million on one side and some similar on the other. But the important point is, obviously, they're all there. These are people like you and I. They wake up, they go to school, they go to their work, but under very unequal conditions, of course. Now, recently, Human Rights Watch has used the word apartheid for these conditions, not just to compare it to apartheid South Africa, actually not at all to compare it to apartheid South Africa, but because apartheid is actually a crime under international law, obviously inspired by the example of South Africa, but of an unequal regime. So there's very unequal conditions, of course. but any vision for the future of this place needs to consider both of these national communities. And unfortunately, there are two unfortunate facts. One unfortunate fact is that, of course, Israel's military victories followed by basically ignoring all national aspirations of Palestinians for the most part, especially since 2009, where Benjamin Netanyahu, a right-wing guy, has been power in Israel. And the impunity with which it acts. It does whatever it wants, it ignores international community, and still gets billions of dollars of military aid from the United States, means that the Palestinian people have been left hopeless. They don't see any prospect of achieving their basic national aspirations in any way. For them to not be a stateless citizens. Now, whether as citizens of Israel or citizens of Palestine or citizens of whatever you want, there is all this discussion about one state or two state solution we can talk about. And yes, exactly, a very good point. Not only Human Rights Watch in America, but B'Tselem, an organization in Israel, has also declared Israel to be an apartheid state by this point. So that's one horrible fact. But the other important fact is, of course, any vision for future needs to include Jews who are living there and their aspirations. Now, you can say whatever you want about the state of Israel, its crimes, all the different sorts of it. But Jews, by this point, by the time 2021, are a national community who are living there. Vast majority of them have been born in Israel, actually. About, I think, of the Israeli Jews, more than 70% are so-called Sabras. Sabra means born in Israel. And of those who are not born in Israel, many of them are born in the Middle East. Now, what is my basic point? My basic point, and I wrote an article published in Newsweek today, on the back of that thread, is to say that on the left, yes, we need to stand with Palestinians, stand against Israeli repression, stand against policies of apartheid, fight for the military aid of the United States to be conditioned to Israel, for the United States to put pressure on Israel, to stand by its international obligations, and a lot of other things. But we need to get rid of this blind anti-Israel attitude, in which we basically don't consider at all the aspirations and the self-determination rights of the 6 million or 7 million Israeli citizens, Israeli Jewish citizens who live there. We cannot do that, and we need to consider them. Now, why is it that some people effectively consider the Israeli Jewish presence in historic Palestine illegitimate? It's because they have this framework of settler colonialism, which leads to consider them illegitimate. Now, settler colonialism, what is it, and does it apply to Israel-Palestine? Mm-hmm. I take my cue from Arnon Dagani, a good friend of mine, an Israeli historian at Hebrew University of Jerusalem, who himself uses the framework of settler colonialism for history of Palestine and Israel. But it's very important to distinguish between colonialism and settler colonialism. Colonialism, it's a mean of another country trying to control another, like one country trying to control the other and exploit its resources. Settler colonialism is a story of some people from a country going to another country and living there. Now, the relationship that they have with the native people will differ from case to case. Yes, ICC is ruling. So ICC hasn't ruled in February. ICC hasn't ruled. They have just declared. They've declared investigations into Israeli war crimes. Not just Israeli, actually, war crimes in Israel, which will be committed whether by Israel or Hamas or other groups. And the Israeli state opposes these investigations. Of course, they should also be supported by all progressives. So go on, settler colonialism. Now, important to remember is that, of course, the relationship between settlers and natives can be very different in different contexts. We live in a country, of course, in which much of the Native American population was genocided out of existence by European white settlers throughout history. And in part of this continent, this obliteration was total, of course. In part of this grand continent of Americas, I mean. But then we have also different levels. Now, in the case of Jewish settlers, there are some very important differences. One important difference is that, of course, these Jewish settlers didn't come from a metropolis or from a European sort of background that had them, that supported them, that there was a state behind them. Quite the opposite. They were the most oppressed, most persecuted group in most places, and they had gone through horrible pogroms and persecutions, whether in Imperial Russia in late 19th century, and of course in the pre-war, pre-Second World War, interwar period, and then in Europe, and finally, of course, throughout the Second World War and the Holocaust. So this was the context in which Zionism started in late 19th century, and the thing that makes Zionism unique, and that you need to understand, is that it was both a settler colonial movement, because it was trying to find a place for Jews to go and start a new society, but it was also a national liberation movement. It's very important to remember that. By the way, Liberia in Africa is also a settler colonial. I didn't actually mention the tribe. I probably should have had. It was also a settler colonial project, again by an oppressed people, like African Americans. I don't have a lot of information about Liberia, but I believe it was both ex-slaves and people who were slaves who were fighting against the slavery, who went to Liberia to try to find a new place, a new society in Liberia. I should actually also read up more on Liberia. But the point is, okay, so the origins of modern Jewish presence in Palestine. So in 1880s, Jews from Europe and different places started going to Palestine. Of course, there were also Jews from before, but they were a smaller part of the population, maybe less than 5%, but they started increasing from 1880s. And as Hitler started persecuting Jews all across Europe in the 1930s, and this number sort of increased, Jews tried to go to different places. Most of the time they were denied entry into most places, especially in this country, which actually was very clear that it didn't want Jews of Europe. And the Zionism was a movement that was settler colonial, but also a national liberation movement. Now, you might not accept that it was a national liberation movement, but it was definitely seen as a national liberation movement by people who were doing it. And it really matters in history how people see themselves. At any rate, the question is this. So this is the background of the story of why are there Jews living in Palestine? Because because their forefathers moved to Palestine for different reasons, some because they were Zionists, some weren't Zionists, some were trying to go anywhere, like most of us. They were trying to find a place to go, and Palestine is one place that they went. But the reason the state of Israel exists and the organized Jewish community exists in Palestine is the Zionist movement decided to create a new society in Palestine. And throughout this process, the Zionist movement, who established a new Jewish society in Palestine, has committed at different points war crimes. It has committed ethnic cleansing. It has committed many horrible things. It has also gained great achievements for all of humanity in many senses. We shouldn't forget. It established great universities. It established great technology, culture, and art, and sometimes good examples of coexistence with Palestinians as well. And of course, the acts of cleansing and the acts of aggressions also have not happened in a vacuum. They have happened in different series of wars. Most importantly, in 1947, it wasn't the Jews didn't just declare a state on their own, right? It's not like they just woke up and decided to declare a state. The international community, the newly founded. So should I stop?
Go ahead.
Should I go on? Yeah. The United Nations, international community, allowed for the formation. Decided. Maybe it was a stupid decision. It was a bad decision, but it was what the world community, international community, majority of countries at the time decided to partition Palestine into a part for a Jewish state and a part for an Arab state. Now, the Jewish state declared itself and founded itself. The Arabs didn't accept that. In fact, the leadership at the time didn't accept any Jewish presence in Palestine, and it started a war. And let me just say something very briefly. It started a war which ended in the expulsion of 750,000 Palestinians from their homelands, which is the beginning of what you can call Palestinian refugee problem. The successors of this 750,000 are today now 6 million Palestinian refugees who live different places, mostly in refugee camps in Lebanon, in Jordan, in Syria, and in West Bank. At the same time, in those years, about 750,000 to even 1 million Jews were kicked out of different Arab countries in different circumstances. Baghdad, you might think New York is a pretty Jewish place if you've been to, but New York is 15% Jewish, I believe. Baghdad, the capital of Iraq, at the time was 45% Jewish, 40 to 45% Jewish. All Jews had to leave, basically. Today, there are like 5 Jews left in Iraq, if that. Actually, I think they might not even be that. And this was mostly complete within a couple of days. So there was a population. There was a sort of a ethnic cleansing on both sides. Basically, Jews were kicked out of Arab countries, and Palestinians were kicked out of Palestine throughout the war. And the Palestinian Liberation Organization, unfortunately, that was formed in 1964. And anyway, we don't want to get deep in history. I'm happy to bring up any point, but it's important to remember the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, didn't have a program for any sort of continuation of Jewish presence in the Palestine. It stood its program. Its first leader said we should drive Jews to the sea being the Mediterranean. And even after that, throughout the years, until the 1990, so the Palestinian National Covenant, which was passed by the PLO, stood for expulsion of vast majority of Jews from Palestine. Effectively, it had a program of ethnic cleansing. It only changed this covenant in 1996. And the example of the Munich Olympics is part of the kind of actions that came out of the movement, as was said in the chat. Anyways, so the point is that there's this sort of horrible history at both sides. And let me just end with this. There is no doubt that there are 2 national communities, as I said. Now, the Jewish. So, who is indigenous? Let's have this question. This is a contentious topic, and I'm here to also learn from indigenous brothers and sisters whenever we have this sort of conversations. Indigenous brothers and sisters in America. I mean, the reality is all political discourse, who is defined as indigenous is always, it's a political construction. In one sense, of course, all humanity originated in Southern Africa, and we have moved around the world. So it is important how the discourse of being indigenous is used and defined. In Britain, where white racists say we are indigenous to this island and everyone else should be second-class citizen or kicked out, obviously that's not something we support. In the United States, where we know that European settlers committed the genocide of the original inhabitants of this land, and where different sort of dispossession and breaking of the treaties with the original inhabitants of this land continues, that discourse has meaning. And in Canada, which I'm more familiar with, I'm also a Canadian citizen. I didn't say this is a story, but I lived in Canada at some point. I am a citizen of Canada. So that has a much more thing. In Israel and Palestine, the Jews with some justification claim to be indigenous to the land. Now, let me see what I mean by first some justification. Of course, there were Jewish societies in Palestine, in what is today Palestine and Israel, which mostly ended about 2,000 years ago, something like that, in the years 200 and 300. And of course, then it's the population who has lived there. I mean, people have moved, people have come and go. my girlfriend is from Mersin in Turkey, which is a few hours drive. These were all part of the Ottoman Empire. My girlfriend's family, if you look at them, some of them are from Lebanon, some of them are from different sort of parts of Turkey, some of them came from different empires. All there was a lot of movements and mobility in humanity, so you can't really go and look at to see who was there for the longest or whatever. But the fact of the matter is, yes, the Zionist movement started moving there in late 19th century and throughout the 20th century, had indigeneity claim to the land that was 2,000 years old, but they were obviously settling the land, and they were settlers versus the natives. You can see it in that way. But the important thing here is there are two national communities at the end of the day. And in a situation like this, you cannot give rights, less or more rights to one of the national communities on the basis of who is indigenous to the land. Unfortunately, PLO's program did that, although they never get to do it. And Israel's laws, racist laws, do that. And also the sort of racist political discourse tries to do that. What we should do instead, and what should be at the center of any emancipatory framework we want to have there, is what was the and this is, I promise I'll end with this,
No, it's
you can
fine.
take it from there, is what was the program of African National Congress actually fighting for
Right.
South Africa. The ANC, unlike the PLO, did not divide the population of South Africa into natives and settlers. It didn't say South Africa belongs to black people, it doesn't belong to white people. Anyone who's gone to, I've sort of gone to South Africa, I actually made a documentary there. South Africa is a wonderfully diverse and rich land with people who are descendants of all sorts of peoples, and of course you could never do that in South Africa. It was the apartheid rule that wanted to divide people like that.
Right.
Instead, so ANC's Freedom Charter of 1955, unlike the Palestinian National Covenant of the PLO, the ANC Freedom Charter said South Africa belongs to all who live there, white or black. And this was always at the basis of ANC. And in Palestine, this was the program of Mahmoud Darwish, the Palestinian national poet, who said our starting point is the recognition of a state of Israel and the right of self-determination for Palestinians. It was a program of Edward Said, the great Palestinian American scholar, whose program was always two peoples, one land.
Mm-hmm.
And it is my concern, and the reason that I made that thread, that unfortunately within a lot of young activists, this perspective is forgotten, and instead you got something that is effectively advocacy of, in its worst form, is an advocacy of ethnic cleansing. To say that the Jews don't belong there, even though they've lived there, the parents lived there, their grandparents lived there in many cases, because they are descendants of a settler movement, and that needs any path to justice, needs to take into account two national communities and their aspirations. Now, whether we get a two-state solution, which I still think is very possible, or a one-state solution, or any other solution, we cannot disregard and delegitimize the existence of the state of Israel, which is a state of these Jews, Israeli Jews who built the state, and of course the Palestinian citizens of Israel who are part of it. That's what I'm destroyed, and that's sort of why intervention in this topic.
Hmm. On all of this, chat, if you're listening, the last 2 weeks that we've all been discussing, he's touching on every single thing, every single thing, every single question that's come up. Um, the pressing question. It seems that on Twitch, in Twitch politics, of course, these are mainly Americans viewing it outside. They feel like the two-state solution is simply not possible. I hope that you can maybe encourage them and change their minds about that, and maybe one, talk about how that could be possible, and is there anything Americans, North Americans can do? Two, three, the issue keeps coming up. Evidently, there was an article that just came out. It was declared this is apartheid.
Mm-hmm.
I was asked, and I grew up with this South America under apartheid. So I was asked, well, don't you think this is apartheid? And I go, no, even if they're calling it that. And I wonder if you can speak to that to clarify it. It seems that that's what's being announced. Although when it comes to Israel and Palestine, decades of many things have been said that where there was nothing behind it. I really hope, obviously, that, oh, you really don't mean apartheid. I mean, you don't mean apartheid, do you? Do you? Because that's how can that even be possible? So rather than be
So,
alarmist, those three things, you could go ahead and speak to those three things.
okay, so I got two things. So let me discuss them, and then we'll see what was the third one that I might have missed.
Sure.
So let me start from the last one. Do I think there's apartheid? Yes, I do actually think that there is a form of apartheid reality
Hmm.
happening. Look, this is a very small place, by the way. By the way, one of the, I traveled to Israel a few years ago. The first reaction that I had, really, and I drove all over the place with my friend, I was like, wow, this place is small. Like, you
Yeah.
really realize what a small piece of land all these fights are about, which really conditions this.
Yeah.
This is not, I don't know how to, it's probably as big as whatever, someone can do the math. But I'm pretty sure North Dakota is like 20 times bigger or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So, so why do I think it's right to say it's a form of, so in some ways it's like a form of, some ways not like. So obviously the state of Israel is a democratic state in which all sorts of different people have a right to run a free press, and there is rule of law, and they're in the parliament, including Palestinian citizens. There are 20% of Israeli Palestinian citizens. They've been in the high court. They've been in the parliament, of course. They've been even diplomats. They've been all over the place. And it's been, and it's been worse in many ways in the last 20 years, in the last 10 years or so. In some ways, if you look from the beginning of Israel to now, the Arab participation or Palestinian participation has increased. But obviously, apartheid South Africa didn't have a black ambassador. It didn't have black members of parliament. It didn't have black mayors. It didn't have anything like that. So in this sense, obviously this is different. But the reality is, the reason B'Tselem and Human Rights Watch and everybody said is that when you look at this entire land that Israel controls, Gaza, West Bank, and Israel proper, effectively the Palestinian citizens of Israel have a bit less rights. They're what you can say unequal citizenship. But more importantly, there are millions of people who, as I said in the beginning of the chat, who live under military occupation right next to their neighbors. There are parts of when I was traveling in Israel with my Jewish Israeli friend who had the Israeli plate. Although even if she was Palestinian citizen of Israel, she would have Israeli plate. Okay, so that would have been different. But we could drive somewhere in 1 hour, whereas if this was a Palestinian plate, it would have taken much longer because it had to pass through all the checkpoints. So it is clear that there is a form of yes, not a strictly based on race, but there is a form based on a status in which stateless Palestinians are living under subjugation there. But look, here's the other thing. Words don't do a magic. This is what I try to do in this trade. People, unfortunately, this is one of the diseases we have in modern politics, in a sense, and especially for younger people. We think when you discover a word, if you just use this word, magically something. If we just call Israel apartheid, something magically will happen when we solve this crisis. No, it won't. That I tried to say earlier, two national communities, that's still gonna be there. If it's 10 times worse than this, that's still gonna be there. If you call it sterile colonial, that's still gonna be there. Yes, it will make you, cooler in a graduate class if you discuss it, or a nice chant in a demonstration. But you don't get rid of the actual. You don't get rid of the actual problem, right?
You see that?
You don't get
You guys, you hear? It's not just me. I'm not the only one saying this thing. You can't conflate, and semantics don't change meaning. Like, this is also the term indigenous. Who gets to say who's indigenous? Okay, you can call us what you want, but those of us who are EU, we know we've been here 30,000 years, and we know what we are, and we know nobody else was here. We know we're indigenous. So words have this magic, okay? When it comes to the law, they do.
Yeah. Yeah.
But don't buy into the word. Understand what is behind the word. Understand the reality so you can talk from and you speak well, and maybe you'll be even more cool in graduate school and way more based on Twitch. But stop co-opting the words. Look deeper. Okay, that's my beef. So go ahead, please.
Yeah, so that's the whole point, right? It's how do we get from being based to actually solving political problems? Look, as I said, two national communities, two peoples, two peoples with these different conditions, we need to, these two peoples need to come to in sort of an arrangement between themselves. Those two peoples with very different disparity in power, right? Disparity in power that wasn't always there, by the way. It's important to remember this. It's not like Jews were stronger from the beginning. They fought in wars, they won wars, they did horrible things in these wars sometimes, but they did win them, and that's how they created the imbalance. And then they get the support of the United States, which they didn't always have, by the way. They didn't always have, and they came very close to being destroyed, at least once in 1967.
Yeah. Indira.
So two-state solution, whether it's possible or impossible. Look, it's again. Let's get real, okay? There is people who consider themselves Palestinian. There are people who are Jewish Israelis, okay? And there are Palestinian citizens of Israel who are in between. They don't always consider themselves Palestinian citizens of Israel, by the way. Some of them consider themselves Arab Israelis. Anyways, that's a different conversation. But generally speaking, there are two national communities.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, why is it? Why I ask you this? Why is two-state solution impossible? People would say because there are a lot of settlements in the West Bank. Well, look, what is the basis of a two-state solution? The basis of two-state solution is Israel holds all the cards. It holds all the power now.
True.
If I was an Israeli citizen, if I lived there, if I was an Israeli prime minister, if they put me as, the king of Israel, like King David of Bible tomorrow, and say, you need to decide, I'd say, look, let me be smart. If we want to continue our life here, if we want Jews to continue have their state, and this state to continue, we're gonna need to end the occupation, because we can't go on forever, because you can't keep on a population. It's immoral, and also it's sort of unstable. So Israel allows for the creation of a Palestinian state somewhere along the 1967 lines. People would say, oh, this is impossible now because you have many settlements. These are illegal settlements according to international law, right? These are Jewish settlements for different reasons built on what should be a Palestinian state. But I don't think that's a big problem. I think that's a solvable problem. I think it's a big problem, but I think a lot of people who say, oh, look, settlements, the two-state solution is not impossible, are dishonest, because they just don't like the two-state solution. So now they're kind of happy that it's impossible, that they can say it's impossible. But it's not impossible. All it takes is this: for Israeli leadership to accept the possibility of a formation of a state somewhere along lines of 1967. You can move the border a little here, you can move the border a little there. You can give some sort of a status to the Jewish settlers there. You can pull some of them out, like you pulled them out of Gaza in 2005 when the Gaza disengagement plan went through. You can do a combination of this. Mm-hmm. And for the Palestinian leadership, to number one, have the support of its own people. But both of these have to have the support of their own people in this, and there are problems with that. And to say, okay, look, we can't get everything, but we will get some presence in Jerusalem. We can have it at our capital, and we will get some territory in which to have our own state. And the question of right and return of refugees, they'll get some compensation, visitation rights. Some of them will be able to go back, and the others can come and become citizens of Palestine. Okay, it would be the beginning of, it's much better than what it is now. And you will have two sovereign states. The states will decide who comes in, who goes out. They'll look everything that a state has. Mm-hmm. This is entirely possible. There's no reason why this is not possible. Mm-hmm. What is the alternative? And that's the question. People who say this is impossible, the alternative is that you'll have one state. Now, look, it's easy. If you imagine, number one, let me tell you something. No two states it's very, very rare for two states in modern state history, last 200 years, to join each other, right? EU is an example of a states not joining each other, but making a confederation, and not even a confederation, really. It's a very, it's very clear. No borders in EU. There's no border control, but the EU, the countries are each clear. And even there, you see there are problems. It's very rare for states to join each other. It's very much more common for them to go away from each other. Even the states in, say, West Indies have not joined together. Even though they used to be together and they have a great cricket team that's still together, but they've never
True.
joined together
That's true.
because people like, because the state has, it's nice to have a state, frankly, and no one wants to give it up. This is what I said in
No.
the trade and all that. No one gives up their state. And you're like South Africa. White South Africans didn't give up their state. They just shared it with the blacks, basically.
True. That's true.
Okay?
In case
They
Jack
shared
didn't
blacks,
didn't
but
realize that it was shared. Yeah, it wasn't really given up. Correct.
yeah, and they're much smaller anyways. They were 15% of the population. And they were very different. It was a very different question. Anyways, so the point is, look, one state solution, wonderful. Great, let's do it. You get Jews to accept to join a state with you, right? It would be great. But actually, let me tell you this. There are two forms of one state solution that are discussed. One of it is a binational state. That's what Edward Said wanted, and that's why many people want it. Binational, people forget this because people don't pay attention to this. We all know, we all have bi friends. We know bi is two, right? So it needs to be Jewish and Arab. So you're not gonna get rid of the concept. The concept is there. You have one state that's both Jewish and Arab. Okay. Now, if you can get the Israeli leadership to accept formation of a Palestinian state and two states side by side, well, then they can join and be in some sort of a confederation, or it can have. So the point of it is, you want to get them. If it's basically much harder. So if two-state solution is hard, getting the one-state solution, it's much harder.
Yes.
Because you're gonna have to get the Jewish population to accept joining one state with Palestinians, and Palestinians to want to do that. Now, as I said, if it happens somehow, great. But the point is, the real question is how to end the occupation of Palestinians. The question is, no one should want to change the ethnic makeup of this place. No one should want, basically, for anyone to leave this place. Let's just say it won't work even if you want. So it's the occupation that needs to end. For Palestinians to have a state, now it's the problem is the statelessness of these Palestinians, basically. So either they should get their own state, or they should join the Israeli state. But if they want to join the Israeli state, you have to first convince the Jewish Israelis to want to share their state with them. Do they want to do that? If you found enough two people who have been in such unfortunate hatred and conflict would want to no to say US and Canada can't join a state together after, with all these things. How is it that Israelis and Palestinians, two people with this unfortunately ugly history of conflict, earlier I said about my mom or the Iran-Iraq war, people forget. It's like, some stupid things you hear online. Oh, there's not a conflict because one side has an army, whatever. Do you know how many Israelis have lost their lives in wars in Palestine? Yeah, not in the last 20 years, but before that. The second Intifada in 1999-2000, 1,000 Israelis died in terrorist attacks. Before that, the 1973 war, 1967 war, 1948 war, many will have died in this process. And all sorts of different events. So, two-state solution might be harder. In my opinion, one-state solution, in many ways, it would be harder. But it's not the main point, actually. It's not the main point. The main point is ending the rightlessness and giving power and sovereignty to the stateless Palestinians. Currently, no Palestinian organization wants a one state. The only ones who say what they want one state, pretty much they want to kick out all the Jews. That's what they say.
Yeah.
Palestinian political organization. And certainly no organization in Israel, whether representing Jewish Israelis or Arab or Palestinian Israelis, none of them want a one-state solution. They all want a two-state solution. We'll need to support them. But people are hypocritic. People say, oh, they support the BDS because the Palestinian civil society said it. But when it comes to the most important political position, they say something that no one on the ground says. It doesn't give.
It's other myths arise too, and complications. It's the history of antagonism, animosity goes so far back. Um that it's hard to imagine if there had ever been a time where Palestine and Israel or Jerusalem weren't enemies. So maybe we'll find out about that era if there ever was one. But the questions are that come up. The apartheid issue comes up. Genocide. Is it genocide or not? And also, how did the Palestinians become stateless somehow? Here was a nation, a historical entity that the entire old world knew about because of its strategic location. It wasn't like it just planted a flag and called itself Palestine. It was always Philistina, always there. And for as Western history, it was there before there was a Western history, this grand city. So, how did the Palestinians become stateless? Resolving that is that the key for sure?
Yes, so actually throughout history this area was called different names and all
Yeah,
that, but let's just, in order to not get lost in all this story, yes, so this
correct.
area was part of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire collapsed after the First World War,
Hmm.
which was a catastrophe.
Yeah.
The Arab lands, the Arab lands were divided between European powers
Hmm.
who were given a mandate by what was called the League of Nations. The League of
Hmm.
Nations, the predecessor to the United Nations,
Hmm.
gave European powers mandates to rule these areas for a while before giving them independence. That sort of was the idea.
Hmm.
Now, Britain got the mandate over Palestine and drew the borders. The borders are not, I mean, there was no Palestine in the Ottoman Empire. There were different vilayats, right? Vilayat being like, there were different provinces in the Ottoman Empire. There was
Hmm.
Jerusalem, there was Nablus. Actually, I think Nablus was part of Beirut province for a while, but there was no one entity called Palestine. There was Jerusalem, there was, anyways, but this area was always called Palestine and different names. But um, there definitely Palestine existed in some form, although the Palestinian identity didn't exist. Okay,
There
there
you
was
go.
people in 19th century didn't call themselves Palestinian, and
Right.
that's fine. No one called themselves. All national identities came to be in that period.
Right.
Um,
Right. How
so,
about that?
so
It's a 20th century construction. Now you've heard it
exactly,
from the source. I've
exactly.
told you. It's true. It's made up. Can
Yeah,
be
we
unmade.
all of the identities we give ourselves are made up, right? These are
Mhm.
ways we
Mhm.
do to make sense of ourselves,
Mhm.
right? Um, it's funny actually. I always thought I was, as a kid. When I say I love Iran, there are borders, so like I love it, but then I don't love it like when it's over
Yeah.
that river because that's Iraq, not Iran. It's
Yeah.
kind of funny.
Yeah. It is
But
funny.
anyway, so but the question of statehood. So British controlled the mandate, and they also did what was called the Balfour Declaration in 1917, in
Mhm.
which the Foreign Secretary of Britain
Mhm.
promised to the Zionists that they could have a Jewish national home, and they allowed some immigration, but very quickly they stopped it. Anyways, that's not the point. The point is, okay, a statehood. How are the states built in the Middle East? These mandates, so Europeans had mandates, yeah? Europeans had mandates. That means League of Nations gave them the control over this area and with the promise
Mhm.
that they'll give it independence after a while. Now, um, what happened was all these areas found their way to independence. For Palestine, as I said before, the United Nations made a decision and said we're going to divide this place partition into two. Jerusalem will be held
Mhm.
jointly, and the rest of it will be divided 55% Jewish state, 45% Arabic state. And there would be Jews and Arabs on both sides, but they will all be equal citizens of these two states. The Jews accepted and declared their state of Israel in May 17th, I think, 1948.
Mhm.
And the Arabs didn't. They did
Correct.
not form a state. They did not form a state. What they did is that they fought the Jews, and then the war went to a ceasefire, like all wars do.
Mhm.
And what happened then was the Gaza was controlled by Egypt at the end of that war, and West Bank was controlled by Jordan. Jordan actually annexed West Bank and gave citizenship to everyone as Jordanian citizenship. So they weren't stateless then in 1948. They had Jordanian citizenship. 750,000 Palestinians, as we said, became refugees in that war, and they went to different places. But those who went to Jordan were given Jordanian citizenship because
Yeah.
Jordan declared that land Jordan. annexed it, declared it Jordan.
Mhm.
And Gaza was controlled by Egypt. Anyways, but in 1967, there was another war, and in 6 days, Israel occupied both West Bank and Jordan. Sorry, West Bank and Gaza, not Jordan.
The
West Bank
Six
and
Days
Gaza,
War.
which is 6 days war in 1967, which it controls to this day, unfortunately. So the reason Palestinians are
Uh,
stateless, the reason Palestinians are stateless is that in the origin of it is that in 1948, unfortunately, their leadership said no to forming up a state, given the opportunity by the United Nations, because they said we need all of this land. None of it should be given to the Jews, um, and there should be no formation of a separate Jewish state. And they lost that war. And then they lost the war in 1967, and Israel has continued the military occupation of this place. Still, it's, of course, the crime of denying rights and statehood to millions of people is done by Israel. We should be very clear about this. It is Israel who does this. And if Israel wanted, it could end this tomorrow. Maybe not tomorrow, but it really could end it in 2 weeks if you ask me. It could declare, you know what, we're withdrawing. Do whatever you want. Form a state. The leadership is clear. Form a state. If I was the leader of Israel, that's what I would do tomorrow. I would say, you know
yeah.
what, we'll give you a state. Here's our borders. We'll unilaterally declare our borders. Because Israel has this excuse that, we give them offers they don't accept. It's not really true. Yes, it's true that sometimes Palestinians have refused, but Israel holds all the cards, right? It
Yeah.
holds all the power,
It holds all the
right?
power.
If you control entire New York City, right,
Mhm.
and you want to give a borough to someone, you can, right? So that's really the situation there.
Mhm. Okay, for chat. Now do you understand what happened? Okay, why the narratives are not matching the realities and why everyone's running around doomer. Do you understand what is necessary? So I want to challenge all of you in the audience, if you want to get cute with me, send me an essay in the Discord. I want to hear what you think would be a good solution for this based on what Professor Azizi is here saying, and also what you've learned about indigeneity and indigenous occupation. Um, give me a short, go in the DM and just knock it out on spicy debate chat. I really want to hear what you have to say. It's not hopeless, but can we do anything? We're here. We're here. Only our Jewish
You should pressure
members of
Israel.
chat can go to Israel. Most of us can't even go. Socrates here has been there, right? He can go to his homeland. We have a few. What can we do as these people are politically invested? What can we do here? What should we do you think? Or
I think
anything?
what I think I should. So I'll say what I think, and we can have a conversation. I think, and I wrote a piece in Newsweek today. I put some ideas in there. I think first we should not. Well, what we should do is we should pressure our representatives to say, look, if you give money to Israel, push Israel so that it uh, it gives up the occupation. We should push. Thank you very much for sharing my article there. Yeah. So we should push to condition military aid to Israel on it ending the occupation.
Okay.
That's basic. That's basic what we should do.
Right. No
And we
aid.
should make
Hmm.
and we should build solidarity with left, with progressives, with
Yeah.
people fighting against occupation in Israel and in Palestine. And there are people. Yes, they've been marginalized under Netanyahu, but we should help them, not enemize them, not boycott them, not vilify them, which is unfortunately what some people do, right?
That's
Not tell
right.
them they're illegitimate, not tell them to take us the bag, not tell them to come, do all this and that. So I think that's the two aspects of policy that we should do: pressure Israel to end the occupation, build links with Israeli progressives. And Israeli progressive, from the left, there are many different forces in Israel that we can talk about, but the anti-occupation camp is a broad one. We should help it. We should want to
Okay.
end the occupation, and we should not be anti-Israel but anti-occupation. There we
Anti-occupation.
go.
I'm all for that. Is there a way for us to reach out to those progressives that might want to start a dialogue that we can be involved in, so that we're not just out here, going la blah, and well, a lot of people are feeling completely helpless and useless, and I think it would be nice if they could at least reach out somehow. Is there a group? Is there so do they have social
There
media? Can anyone kind of coordinate and network so that this
many
can be done?
groups. There are many good groups. There is JS Street, which is a pro peace organization, Jewish organization in America. JS Street. There is, if not now, a also organization of Jewish activists who's having no JS Street. Sorry, like just J. Can I write in the chat?
Sure, yes you can.
Yeah, exactly. You got it
I
though.
got
You
it.
got it right.
Sorry.
Yeah. Now, of course. So there's JS Street. There's so if not now, Americans for Peace Now. So Peace Now is an organization for peace in Israel. Then there's Americans for Peace Now. That does kind of work. That does that kind of work. And then there are sort of different progressive organizations. There's Hadash.
Hadash.
Hadash is in Israel itself. It's actually its main part is the Communist Party of Israel.
There you go.
Um,
Hi, Mask.
and yes, exactly. And Hadash is both Palestinian citizens of Israel and Jewish citizens of Israel, and it does great solidarity work. And of course, there are many Palestinian solidarity organizations, and we should work with them. But we should also be honest and say, look, the BDS movement has not worked. Trying to boycott Israelis doesn't work. Trying to boycott Israeli academics and artists and playwrights has not worked. So we should
Right.
break with that kind of politics,
Right.
and build solidarity with the leftists on the region. Pro-Palestine, pro-Israel. We shouldn't be anti any nation. We should be pro both of the nations and work for peace and an end to occupation.
That's what we need to do. Do you hear the difference? And so he's not, perhaps in Iran his family were indigenous, but this is an indigenous perspective. We spend our lives where warfare means extinction, right? Every war chief becomes a peace chief if he survives himself long enough to realize that even the loss of one life is too much. So there's a way to get along together with, no matter how we feel, no matter how different. Can you commit here to doing these positive things? Anti-occupation, not anti-Israel. Respect both nations. Put the conditions on the military. Can we get it together? Most of you are on what you call the left of politics. He's speaking directly to you. We on the left need to fix our broken political rhetoric. Also, canceling Israeli authors and elites and intellectuals. Okay, now, from what I see on Twitch, that's already begun. I don't know when, but it was a complete reversal because a month before it was the opposite. So, those of you sitting here, please don't do that. Don't cancel culture on Israel. You're going to make it worse. We have an opportunity here to communicate, to get in a dialogue, to at least feel like you've done something toward peace. On top of the million other problems that we're facing here in this country after the last 4 years. So, let's get together and do this. So this is an invitation for you to get together, come into the Discord. Let's start a dialogue on this and let's make some plans and let's see if we can do some outreach. Also, have you reached out to any Palestinian people? I mean, those of you in chat are probably not stringers. You don't have to watch these feeds come in live every single day like I have to. So you don't have to see what I have to see every day. Okay, I get that. But if we can't come and talk openly and remember these are all human beings, you know? Then and this is why I brought the Professor Azizi here. I wanted you to hear this from a source, somebody who can say with authority, you know? And give you a different perspective, you know. All is not lost as long as the Palestinians live. All is not lost. But the very looming reality of these horrible words which have this power to frighten us so badly, apartheid and genocide. And they become more concretized every day. I'm a discourse analyst. I want to disrupt the power of that word. I rebuke the power of those words from a people who have suffered apartheid and genocide. If you keep talking about it long enough, you might make it real. I will have nothing to do with it, so I'm asking you to listen and participate so that you can stop it too. Counter that narrative. Don't deny it like a Holocaust denier, but we need to do something to disarm those terms, those narratives, because it's almost as if people almost wanted to go that way. That way, it'll finally be resolved. When you have fought so long, any any solution, any ending is preferable than no ending. So you're gonna have to understand that. Most of you are not military. You do not understand warfare. You're not minorities. You've not been arrested. You've not been persecuted. You've not been hunted down, etc., etc., etc. Those of you who have, it's time for this dialogue. And so he's given us a great deal of time and knowledge. And we're hoping that also you can, Professor Azizi, throw us some networks or maybe guide us through or walk it through. Perhaps some of us can go and sit in on a class as guests at some point. I don't know. To start allowing these
Please,
people to
if
be
you connect
involved.
with me,
Mm-hmm.
you connected me on Twitter.
Mm-hmm.
That's maybe the best. Arash underline
Twitter.
Tehran is Twitter, and yeah, message me for sure. You know, I teach in the summer. We can maybe sort of join some of the classes or some of the different sort of educational work that we do. I'd love to be in touch, and
Um,
that's sort of
great.
itself how we change things, right? By networking, by staying in touch, by listening to each other, by learning from each other, and by trying to change things.
By learning from each other and by trying to change things. And there is the Twitter. Start opening some doors, okay? Unless you want a nail in the coffin, you better kick your way out. Do it like Kill Bill, where she just punched her way through. I don't care. But it's horribly disturbing to us here. It's that thing that everybody's up now, nobody is sleeping. They can't talk about anything else. And so let's talk about it. You have this great, fantastic guest giving us an opportunity here to learn and network. And there's the Twitter. So follow the thread. Um, Reach out. Okay, ask for a dialogue. Right. I'm sure a lot of those people there feel terribly isolated right now. They would be surprised if, you know, 128 lefties from Twitch knocked on the door and said, "Hey, can we talk?" So, make something happen, okay? Okay, those of you content creators, Socrates, I was hoping Amy C3, Death of Certainty. If Professor Azizi has a little time, I would like, if you want to join him, we can panel up a bit. And would you like to have a short conversation? We can't keep him all night. Um,
I'm happy. Let's talk.
we'll sit. I'll sit here all night. I'll sit here for 4 days. But all you content creators, check in. You're welcome. We are in. I forgot my own voice chat. Socrates is here. Here is Socrates, who is Jewish. Pan is in the waiting room, escorting guests. That's the moderator.
I
Uh,
thought Socrates was Greek.
he's teasing you. See his name? He's just teasing you. Okay.
Wait, so
Wick.
I'm so technologically backward. So Socrates comes here, but he doesn't show here. Okay, I see.
You'll hear him in a second. You should be able to hear
So
him
this
when
is
he turns his mic
they
on.
come on the. Oh, I see. Okay,
It's strange. They sit in the waiting room where the moderator's at. That's Pan.
but we don't see them.
You don't, and I drag them in.
Okay, their voice, nice.
You're gonna hear their voice, yeah.
You know what I
This
love?
is
Can I just say something?
there.
Look,
You
can I just
go.
say something? Oh, okay, we see them. Beautiful. Hi, Socrates. So look, here's the, so I'm all about, so I'm like, oh, I'm so old, like I'm trying to figure this out. It's like so new, and all my like students are on whatever, like TikTok. But it's actually, this Twitch is a little bit like return to the early days of internet, which
Yeah.
I'm old enough to remember. I don't know who else is old enough, but what I love about internet, as a kid in Iran who was in internet was super anonymous. I mean,
Uh huh.
it was not a place where anyone had. In fact, what you asked people at the time was ASL, like age, sex, location, which was sort of big at a time, and then everyone said something, but it never followed. You never even asked for someone's picture. It was like, it like would have been a creepy thing to even ask for someone's picture.
Uh huh.
So, anyways, it's kind of cool.
Okay. Wick
Just so you
should be
know, the
here.
oldie. Remember.
Yeah, I'm here. I can't turn on the camera because I'm like I'm making a grilled cheese sandwich. I'm not at my computer, but I can still talk.
Oh, good.
Isn't this? It's just like a radio station. I feel like we're at Al Jazeera right now, trying to cover the footage of things. Um.
Oh man, can I just say real quick that this is like I don't consider myself very educated on this topic, and so
You are
hearing
now.
all the things being discussed, yeah, this has been a really helpful thing for me. So I really appreciate it. I really appreciate you for coming on, and Yudi for hosting him.
Mm-hmm.
It's been awesome. So thank you.
Well, let's make use of the time then. Those of you who are here, if Amy C3 comes in, one of the mods, please invite her into the chat. I know she was very interested in paneling up, and she's super well respected. I want to accommodate all of you content creators because you know the drill, you know how this all works. Okay, but
Oh
chat,
yes,
please hang
yes.
around. Okay, I'm gonna let you chat if you will. This is a little bit unusual to Twitch. Let you all chat, and uh, I'm gonna step out for just a second. I'm gonna just let you start to dialogue. I will be right back. And chat, hang out, get questions ready if you have them, and I'm gonna field it. But I'll let you basically meet your fans. These guys have been waiting a while to meet you. So this is Wick, whom you cannot see. This is Socrates, who you can. Pan
Hello.
is your moderator. She is in the waiting room, and I will step out for just a minute. I'll be right back. But go ahead and just continue the conversation.
Right, let's do it.
Right, so I have grown up in America as a Jew. Like I've just my whole life I've heard things about Israel, and especially more recently in the past, kind of 10, 15 years, hearing more like, oh, like any criticism of the state of Israel is like anti-Semitic. So I've felt like it was something that like I needed to do, or kind of a duty I had, like to myself and to Israel Palestine, to learn something about it, because especially I started reading, I think, Image and Reality, Norman Finkelstein book, and I was just like, it kind of took my breath away, because there were so many things I learned that were just outright lies, just false history, and it was kind of freeing to learn some real stuff. So I really appreciate you coming here to
Thank
teach.
you very much. Yeah, I love Norman Finkelstein. I think he's great, and it's unfortunate that he really stood up and fought for Palestinian rights, and fought, inside the Jewish community for a very long time, and he really has spent, he really paid the price for it. And now, many people have basically censored him just because he doesn't support the BDS, and he basically says, look, you can't have your, he says, he has a famous sentence. He says, if you're for international law, you can't say I'm international law, when it comes to your occupation, but when it comes to Israel, I don't recognize Israel. So I think the way he puts that is like, you can't say, when it's green, I believe you can go, but when it's red, I'm agnostic. Like the traffic light.
Yeah, I've heard that quote. I love that. And he said also, I think, that he's like against BDS TM, like the specific organization or movement, but not the tactics. Obviously,
Yeah, of course, you can use, the boycott tactics can sometimes be used, but I mean, you all you need to learn about how crazy this movement has become is that someone like Norman Finkelstein is considered to be not sort of pro-Palestine enough, and it's like it's crazy. You know who else has gone through boycotts? Edward Said, great Palestinian. He founded an orchestra that included Palestinian and Israeli orchestra musicians playing with each other. Have nothing to do with the state. He was based in Spain. He just had Palestinians and Israelis. But they even boycotted that because they're against this sort of idea of coexistence. Anyways, so that's sort of the story. Of course, imagine, this is what makes one sad. Imagine if the BDS movement said, let's boycott the products from the illegal settlements, right? Let's all agree, do that. I have many Israeli friends. I have an Israeli friend, she didn't go to her sister's wedding because it wasn't in a settlement. That's how strongly many of them are Zionists, by the way. Meretz, the Zionist party, the Socialist Zionist party, boycott settlement products. So you could have had such a broad group of people, but the politics of the BDS, effectively, if you're Israeli, there's no way you can be included, really, unless you need to want to leave, basically, So, unfortunately, and one thing I would also say, by the way, about the shifting politics in the American Jewish community, which is obviously millions of people, so it's different politics and all that. It's great that many young American Jews are questioning the old unquestionable support for Israel. And of course, it's, to be honest, it's kind of silly to say criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic, of course, because it's a state. You can criticize it like any other state. And also, it's really, I mean, it's a conflict of two peoples there. You know, it's very different from the sort of classic anti-Semitism in Europe and all that. But I should say something. Look, the state of Israel was created by the Jewish people.
Yes.
Jewish Americans supported it by and large. They gave money to it. The more left wing they were, the more they supported it.
Yep.
You know, because it was rising from the ashes of Hitler. It was a national liberation movement. And I don't see anything progressive about saying, "Oh yeah, I'm an American Jew now. I don't give a fuck about Israel. It's not my state. I don't care about it." I don't see anything progressive about that. That's just disowning, basically, something that came out of your community. Now, of course, it's anti-Semitic to go to a Jewish person and ask them to be responsible for Israel. But it is, as I said, it came out of a community and other people. I don't see what's progressive about saying I don't give a fuck about it, basically. That it's just not my problem. I don't, you know, I don't want to talk about it.
Well, I mean, I mean that's kind of an American problem in general. Like we tend not to care about events that aren't in America. So I mean, yeah. So I see exactly what you're saying, and it's not progressive at all. But we tend to be very selective about our progressive movements here, and it's saddening. It's disheartening.
Yeah, exactly. And you know, and it's a difficult situation. The reality is, if you look at this in any serious humanity, you know, it's a difficult situation. I mean, if you go, you know, to Israel, who are these? You know, just a small point that really come up in Israel that was interesting for me. I was talking to an old lady in Israel once, and she was talking about. She said, "Oh, one of my friends, we call it the one with the grandparents." I said, "What do you mean the one with the grandparents?" She said, "Well, it was very unusual for someone when I was grew up to have grandparents, because everyone's grandparents had died in the Holocaust. So if someone had grandparents, this was stood up. They said, oh, this person is so weird. They have both of their grandparents." This is really the background we're talking about. No, that's the background of people, Jews from Europe. And Jews from Middle East, it's not any better. You know, they came in very tough conditions. And Jews from Ethiopia as well, you know, which are a big part of Israel. So this is really the nation here. The other thing that's like, I mean, that's just like yeah, exactly. And Russia,
where my family came from. Yeah, all the pogroms.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, you know, Putin recently said that he considers Israel to be a Russian-speaking country. You know, sort of part of the Russian world, and he has a point. If you go to Israel,
yeah, a lot of Russian Jews went to Israel. Yeah.
So in Israel, I think Israel, one of the things that it's very fascinating Israel for me is a super multilingual country. So as you know, I speak Persian. In Israel, I spoke more Persian than I have in any other country except Iran, because of Afghans and Iranian Jews that I could find. You know, you could find. But Russian, I really think as a social experiment that if you speak Russian, you can get by in Israel without speaking a word of Hebrew or English, because you'll run into someone who speaks Russian usually. So yeah,
I had oh sorry.
Go ahead and continue. I'm glad to be back. Go ahead.
Yeah, I had a question because on that topic of like what's the way that we can kind of put pressure to maybe proceed. I had exactly the same thought of like putting conditions on military aid because that's something the U.S. can do kind of unilaterally, and we could like pressure Biden to do something. Your answer was to condition that aid on ending the occupation, and I feel like there's I have like a concern of what like ambiguities within that could make things really, really slow. So like first people won't agree on like what the occupation is or what it means to end the occupation, or if there is an occupation. And
well, everyone agrees with this. I mean, Israel, no one actually disagrees with, you know, it's the green line, right? The basic, so, you know, you might say, well, of course, when we say in the occupation means go for a negotiated settlement. Also, I said that as the end goal. Well, first you can say, you know, first, you can basically make it clear that the occupation is unacceptable, right? Now, how we get to that, it's very difficult because, on the Palestinian side right now, you have a leadership crisis. The elections were just cancelled. But if you have a push from America, like you did under John Kerry, like under Obama, second term, but you had a push without, like basically there was a drive, let's have negotiations, whatever, but there was no actual anything. Like the last American president who actually started playing with the money with Israel was George Bush, not W, but the father.
Oh, in the 90s, Bush. Oh, okay.
Yeah, which is why they really hate him in Israel, actually, and many people, right? So he basically said this, I think it was $10 million, and basically said, look, you can't use this money to build the settlements, right? So push, okay, so when I say in the occupation, number one, halt settlements, although now there are already too many, but don't let any more settlements.
Okay. That's exactly what I was going to ask, was like, I was thinking like, well, if you say halt the settlements, it's really clear, like it's just a number. It's not any kind of thing that's difficult for people to understand. And Netanyahu won't want to because he'll lose the Orthodox support in the Knesset. So it puts him in a bind where he's like very clearly violating, and he'll lose the aid.
To be honest, so long as Netanyahu is there is limited things he can do. But remember, what's also the effect of pressure in Israeli society? It will help push forward the more anti-occupation forces. Because imagine if you're an Israeli, you're like, oh wait, if we support these guys, we're gonna lose this. The real tragedy.
We won't be able to defend ourselves unless we end the occupation.
Exactly, and all that. And the real tragedy is, especially in the last 4 years, is that of course Trump gave Netanyahu everything he wanted, right? Yeah. And some more.
Really weird. When Netanyahu would just come and like just respect Obama on like the Senate floor is so strange.
Yeah, so you have all those things, and and Trump get Netanyahu everything he wanted. So of course, why if you're Jewish Israeli, you basically it helped the extremists because they're like, oh, we can get away with everything we want, and you can have a moral justification for it. Unfortunately, there are racist ideas and sort of exclusionary expansionist ideas ripe in Israel. Now you have outright fascists in the Israeli parliament, in the form of the religious Zionist party, and I don't use this term lightly. I don't mean there's sometimes. I mean, people in the religious Zionist party include serious homophobe. By homophobe, I mean people who say homosexuals should not exist, and they're like, shame on them. Yeah, the Noam party. That's part of it. I'm talking about Itamar Ben-Gvir, a politician who on his wall he has a picture of Baruch Goldstein. Now, who's Baruch Goldstein? A man who in the 1990s went to a mosque in Hebron and killed 30 people who were praying. So, you have some really rabid right-wing forces there, and of course, like all other right-wing politics, they have their own ways of justifying this. This is our God-given land. God has given us this land, all the rest of it. But the point is, if we need a movement, right? A movement, anti-occupation movement. You had this movement before. Under peace now in Israel, there is a reason Yitzhak Rabin was killed, and he had millions of support. So you need a movement, and as part of that would be a question of conditioning military aid. It won't be easy, by the way, and none of that will, it will backfire at some point. It's not like you want to imagine a very crazy situation in which actually Israel says, oh, you know what, fuck you, we don't want the United States. We cannot go our own way and do different things and get help from Russia and China. We won't ask any questions. It's like that's something extreme, right? But my point is, it's not a magic card. It's not like you put conditions and they say, oh, okay, now we'll do it. The sustained movement for peace.
I do have a question on that. So say we put the pressure on our politicians and things like that, and Biden, does what is needed to help end the occupation. Can you think of a way? Because this is kind of my sticking point here. Can you think of a way to keep, say, the 2024 elections get in, and Trump gets reelected for some reason, or someone like him? How do we keep America from just going back to its old ways on this and undoing all the good that the pressure we put on helps? Like, is there a mechanism or something you can think of that'll
I mean, it's elections have consequences in democratic countries, and yeah, if your side wins that has different policies, unfortunately, that's going to be it. But this is also why it's one of the saddest things about Israeli-Palestine conflict is that this is this weird story of politics is how things align, right? And with America and Iran, you also have at that, like you have someone, when the mood in Iran is for peace, you have someone here who is not, or the other way around. I mean, you go crazy. I'm a historian. You really can't sleep at night sometimes thinking, what if things would have gone a little... For example, in 1967, what would have happened if Jordan didn't join the fight? Mm-hmm. Which everyone in Israel told it, by the way, don't do it. Don't join the fight. Syria and Egypt are fighting. Don't join it. There would be no problem today. There would be no problem as we know it. There would be a problem of Palestinian refugees, but, there are many people have been made refugees everywhere. People also forget this, by the way, that at the end of the Second World War, millions of people got moved. Millions of Germans and Hungarians were moved from lands they had always lived in, and people continue lives. The problem it's a problem to be kicked out of your land. Unfortunately, of course, it's a problem. But if your kids are born in another land, and they have citizenship there, and after a while they can hopefully go on back and visit at least there. It's not like everyone just wants to live where their great grandparents lived, right? That it's not like anyways. You know what I mean. So my point is it's always
cool off over time instead of escalate.
Yeah
if they can settle.
Yeah. So I think the point is to have the problem we have, this is the really sad part, and it's really I'm very glad we have this sort of we have had a good chat here, and I have got good reactions to the article, right? But the real problem is that there's a big... I get a lot of hate. I'm someone who opposes the occupation and all that, but I get a lot of hate just because I say you should be anti-Israel, and I'm not alone,
Sure.
So we have a real problem because we have at one side we have people who are fully in support of Netanyahu, fully support the war on Gaza, fully support all of it, and then we have other people who basically wish Israel didn't exist. That's sort of what it is, right? They wish Israel didn't exist, just like they wished. Actually, the U.S. is also still crying. They wish it didn't exist. So, great, but it's not gonna happen, right?
It's gonna
They're there.
I wanted to ask yet. I remember in your tweet, you said if you don't see Iran in this conflict, then you must be blind or willfully ignorant or something. Have we spoken yet about Iran's involvement? And if not, let's talk about that. I don't think these people know anything about that, so let's have it.
I would be really interested to hear about that.
Yeah, we're all ears.
So the real story is, Iran, the Islamic Republic of Iran, is the only serious state that gives serious support, military and financial support, to Hamas and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. These are anti-peace groups. From the first day that Islamic Republic was founded, it has helped the anti-peace Palestinian groups. And throughout the years of the peace process, Madrid Conference of 1991 and then Oslo of 1993, Iran has helped what you can call the rejectionist camp. This is the camp that basically says, Israel shouldn't exist, right? They reject the existence of Israel. Iran has helped them, and unfortunately, if today, just think about it, actually. If Hamas hadn't started raining rockets on Israel, the world was in so much sympathy with the Palestinian movement in Jerusalem and a civic movement, and had the movement continued, people are so stupid who don't see that, frankly, honestly. I just get, what defense could Israel have if they had said these are Palestinian citizens, fighting, Palestinian people fighting for their homes, fighting for their rights in East Jerusalem, versus saying, well, we're faced with a terrorist organization, everyone's acting as terrorists, and they're raining rockets on Israeli cities, as Hamas does. Now, where does Hamas get its rocket? Iran. Which state Iran is the only state in the world that fights Israel like this. Only one. They used to be many, they're all gone. No one really fights Israel like this anymore. They don't have relations with many states, but Iran is the only one that really takes the fight to Israel. in this way and gives support to terrorist groups both in Gaza and in Lebanon.
So is Iran doing this for ideological reasons, or do you think they have a more geopolitical kind of reason for supporting Hamas and anti-Israel, anti-peace kind of movements?
It's both.
Oh,
Yeah, so it's a good question. Well, that's exactly sort of, that's sort of what my book is about in a sense, and the whole question around. Look, so it's basically the Islamic Republic uses this anti-Israel hatred as a way to organize its neighbors, but it also uses it to push the power of this Iranian regime, right? The Iranian people, on the other hand, let me just say, the Iranian people are basically sick of their resources being used to help terrorist groups in the Arab world. That's basically this. And frankly, it would be it's really funny because, Vox on Twitter think I'm like anti-Israel or whatever. But the Iranian standards, I'll be very on the pro-Palestinian extreme almost, frankly. Unfortunately, in Iran, because there's so much opposition to the government, they just hate any... also, Iranians ask themselves, Hamas and Islamic Jihad get those rockets, we don't have money to eat. Iran is in the worst economic conditions it's long been. People have nothing to eat. People have to live under those conditions. And they give the money for rockets to these people. We don't want this. What's our fight with Israel? Iranians will ask themselves. Actually, okay, you know what? Palestinians is very sad. We should support them. But what's our fight with Israel? We don't have a fight with Israel. Mm-hmm. We had good relations with Israel for many years. In the Iran-Iraq war, I'm not sure if you guys were here. I talk about how I was born in the middle of this war, and my mom was... Do you know who helped Iran in that war? Israel. Mm-hmm. It helped the Islamic Republic of Iran. Do you know who helped Saddam? The PLO, Palestinian Liberation Organization. And I don't think, this doesn't mean we should be anti-Palestinians, but we should, we have no fights with Israel. What problem does Iran have with Israel? Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's no reason for Iran to fight with Israel, right?
It's
not a problem.
Is there something I could ask actually? Because I was thinking about like another kind of angle to this. I laughed for a moment because out of kind of pain, thinking about like, oh, it would be great like if there's things we could do in America to help influence and bolster the people who are fighting against using this aid in Iran. It's like, oh shoot, and of course like Trump just torpedoed the nuclear deal. But like, is there any chance that you think that the Iranians would be feel any trust to be able to start a new nuclear treaty to end sanctions, and then like not make it contingent, but try to push to support like not giving aid to Hamas in Iran as part of that treaty, but not contingent?
It's interesting that you said so. So number one, there's right now negotiations going on in Vienna for the resumption of the Iran deal. So for America's re-entry to the JCPOA, also known as the Iran deal, which was signed in Vienna in 2015. So right now in Vienna, there are conversations, and I hope Iran has now, there are different complex politics to this. Iran has a presidential elections in less than a month. Very restricted presidential elections. Almost no one's allowed to run. Khamenei, the supreme leader, runs the politics there. Now, excellent point, because Iran says it won't talk about its supports to groups, but effectively, of course, it's part of it in very complicated ways. But I'm in support of diplomacy with Iran, and I'm in support of the Iran deal. And I believe the more ties that there are between countries. The opponents of this say, oh, if Iran gets the deal, it gets money, and they will use this money on Hamas and all that. Of course, that is partially true. I mean, if Iran gets more money, it can use it for these purposes. But, leverage is a funny thing. People love this word, leverage. And like Trump supposedly has great leverage, because of the sanctions. But, imagine the three of us here, right? So, I can come and stop your income. I can stop water from your house. This is one form of leverage, right? So I say but what if you and I do business together, right? So
Their vote.
it's also true with the Abraham Accords. That's the big leverage, right? If you want to open a place together, and if I know, oh, you know what, maybe I don't like Socrates, but if I broke this off, I mean, we're making money together. You know, we have business together. He will, you know, I'll lose all the money, he'll lose all the money, so we have an interest to go on. You know, so this is also true with Abraham Accords, by the way. UAE, if UAE ends up investing billions of dollars in Israel, that's leverage.
Yeah, it's huge leverage. Yeah.
Right? That's huge leverage. I mean, it's, you know, it's what BDSers don't understand, because they say, oh, this you know, divestment or whatever. But it's the same question, by the way, sanctions, right? You know, that's sort of you just saying, you know, people won't hurt their own economic interests for whatever, you know, reasons you think there are. But you know, they can influence policy, right? Anyways, and when it comes to Israel, that's the thing about. By the way, the question of pressure. Let's be clear about something. You can pressure Israel to withdraw from the Palestinian territories. You can pressure Israel to start peace negotiations. Any sort of pressure you can think about, but you cannot pressure Israel to cease to exist. You know, that makes no sense, right?
Yeah.
No country's gonna do that. So yeah.
I mean, what does it even mean? It's like, oh, so you pressured me, so now I accept to. I mean, I don't know what these people think will happen. You know, dissolve myself and declare a democratic state or whatever.
Yeah, like an
it's a stupid.
It's a stupid idea. So you think that capitalism, good old-fashioned economic, you know, grift may end up being the ultimate peacemaker there when everybody realizes just how much money they're losing eventually? They'll think maybe we should call this off for a while.
I hate to, you know, as a Marxist, I hate to advocate for this idea, but I mean, there's definitely truth to it.
Yeah.
In fact, to be honest, I mean, Trump.
Economics is power.
Well, Trump was hard. You know,
we don't
Trump
have
and
to,
Jared Kushner. I mean,
we don't have to advocate for it to recognize the reality of it. I agree. Trump and Jared Kushner. Yeah. Well, yes. Let's talk about that if you'd like to. We'd all want to talk about that. Go ahead.
Well, the deal of the century was stupid, and because I mean, obviously there was no, you know, the state that offered Palestinians was really Bantustans, like South Africa was like. But the basis of the idea was there's be huge economics in this, and to be honest, no, that is a big part. This is also, look, here's a general conversation on history and politics, you know, Middle East, whatever. People miss this. You know, people think everyone acts there as some sort of a deep sense of identity, and they forget that, look, most people, like all of us here, you know, all of us here, I mean, this is actually a basic Marxist insight, that economic self-interest is very important, right? People want to have jobs, people want to, you know, if Israel wasn't a country with a GDP per capita of like, I don't know, 40,000 or something, it would be a very different conversation. So these are people of a very successful, rich state. You know, it's, so this stuff really matters more than whatever, right? I mean, yeah, it's like, do Americans wake up every morning and think, oh, yeah, what is our national identity? What does it really mean to be an American? I mean, it's like all this talk, like, or do immigrants come here because they love our values? No, they come here because people, I mean, as an immigrant, you know, people migrate because there's opportunity for a better life. And for a better life, it means, let's face it, first of all, economy, right? The first thing, it's actually Marx's oldest insight. The first thing, you know, Marx says in the introduction to critical political economy that you need to have food before you can have religion or have anything, you know. Existence predates social conditions, social consciousness. So, you know, there is an economic basis to everything, and the economy should be and can be the basis of peace.
I was wondering if I could ask, and sorry if I'm asking too many questions if other people have, but I was wondering if I could get your thoughts really quickly on just three organizations, because what you said about Hamas and its kind of geopolitical ties to Iran and what that means was really, really enlightening. So when it comes to Hamas, when it comes to Hezbollah, and when it comes to the PLO, just your just like very briefly thoughts on like kind of what their role is, like why they may exist as an organization that they do geopolitically, and like kind of what their overall effect is, like working toward peace or against peace.
Yeah.
So Hezbollah, Hamas, PLO, right?
Yeah.
Hezbollah. So Hezbollah is an organization based in Hezbollah is an organization created by Iran, planned by Iran, by the Islamic Republic of Iran in 1980. Um, Beginning of the revolution, they created this organization, and it represents the Shias of Lebanon mostly. But effectively, it's a political party slash militia that plays a very negative role in Lebanon. Is a repressive force there, part of a corrupt sort of political system there, and of course, it attacks, it runs missiles on Israel. But effectively, it's an arm of the Iranian state. It's like Iran can shut it off, like you shut off your, bathtub. What do you call it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Faucet.
Yes.
Wow.
Faucet.
Yeah.
On off like
Iran
that.
can really do that. Yeah, it
Yeah.
really can.
Yeah.
It gives them all their money. It gives them all their, and there is. Yeah, so that's Hezbollah for you. Of course, this doesn't mean that Hezbollah doesn't have a social base and everything. It does, but as an organization, effectively, Iran sort of controls it. And if it wasn't for Iran, it won't really threaten Israel in any serious way. Now, Hamas is an organization with serious base among Palestinians, in both West Bank and Gaza and across Palestine. Is an Islamist organization, of course. It's rooted in the General Muslim Brotherhood organization. Muslim Brotherhood was an organization founded in Egypt in 1928. But actually, also, Hamas has two wings, if you will. And there is a wing which is basically conservative middle-class businessmen, engineers, that sort of thing. And that would be, ultimately, if there was a peace deal with Israel, it would play ball. But there is a wing that, again, is funded by Iran and gets missiles and military equipment by Iran. And, it's sort of, that's the wing that's doing the attacks and all that. And, so Dan said we're gonna introduce in a second. So, and the PLO, Palestinian Liberation Organization, it's the umbrella organization of the Palestinian movement, of which the main party is Fatah, and this is the one that controls West Bank now under the Palestinian Authority. The problem with the PLO is that it's lost its democratic legitimacy because the elections have not been held for a long time. They were supposed to be May 22nd. President Mahmoud Abbas, who's 80-something and sick and old and unpopular, has cancelled it. He said he cancelled it because Israel didn't allow elections to be held in East Jerusalem, but everyone sees that as sort of an excuse. So the PLO is basically an umbrella organization, which has accepted Israel for a long time and ready to sort of build the Palestinian state. It controls what is called a state of Palestine according to UN, a state that exists but doesn't have sovereignty. So the problem with it is it's the lack of democratic legitimacy.
Okay. Professor Azizi, this is
Thank you.
Dan. Dan is a student and a local, in other words, Twitch historian, and so he's popped in, and so I hope you enjoy speaking with him and adding him. And he's a very accurate young man. He's a very precise young man.
Yeah, I always I've always wanted to speak to you, Arash. It's I've seen your work around for a good while and an Iranian topic, so it's a very well honored opportunity to speak to you.
It's great to speak to you, Dan. Wonderful. What kind of history are you interested in?
I am a immigration expert. So I study specifically immigration patterns that happened in early medieval times to 1800s United States, where like giving an idea of what people move from certain places and what would drive them economically, socially, to cultural changes that would drive people to drop everything they owe in their own city and move across a very dangerous trail to California, as an example. Yeah, that's usually my area of my study, but I am familiar with many of the other areas, including Parthian history, which I had a professor who was an expert in, who wrote stuff in it. So, but
for those who don't know, Parthia is an old empire that controlled Iran from about 200 BC to 200.
220, yeah, until the Sassanids beat them and all of that. Yeah, I am very, I wanted your opinion on this, as you you study the area of Iran. What is since like the Shah was overthrown in the 1970s, how does this culture of like authoritarianism always come from like the cultural situation that happens around Iran?
So,
Ever even before that,
did you say that again?
since like ever even till now, we have authoritarian leaders that have been ruling Iran, but even after what the nationalization that happened in the 1950s, do you think that there still is a chance to be reformed in a way without having a conflict?
Well, if you ask me whether I think there are sort of chances of democracy in Iran, of course, I believe that's possible, and Iranians have yearned for democracy for a very long time, from the constitutional revolution of 1905, 1906, where we fought for it, to 2009 when we had a massive movement, and of course movements of the last few years against the government. So, but unfortunately, the situation in Iran is very difficult right now because there is no organized opposition, and the regime has closed the political space more than ever. But you cannot leave but without hope. I mean, that's sort of the rule of politics. You should always have hope and optimism. Now, the challenge is to build a democratic opposition, which we do not have an organized one, unfortunately, right now. But in politics, as I say, you have to always maintain hope and optimism. The reality is that millions of Iranians yearn for democracy and are ready to fight with this government. And what makes Iran more hopeful than China in some ways, for example, or other places, is that the authoritarian system is not very strong, i.e. the government is in a lot of crisis and it clearly lacks legitimacy. So the idea that at some point it will end, especially when the current leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, dies, he's 82. Thank God people don't live forever, so he'll die soon. And that there will be some opening. We do maintain that hope, but things don't currently look very good, and the U.S. sanctions haven't helped, in my opinion, because they've weakened society. They've weakened the type of people. Here is their old rule, right? People don't come out to fight for democracy when they have problem filling their stomachs, right? When they're hungry. That's the important rule. Whereas they will come out when they have more space. Which is why the sort of sanctions have been very foolish and actually helped to strengthen the dictatorship in Iran.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for the answer.
For the free answer. It is nice to talk to someone who's a national, so we can finally hear, from, and not about. Which is my whole thing, is to speak from. So everything he's saying is so good for us to hear. So it's so appreciative.
Yeah, I've talked to many other Iranian nationals who came from United States, and they always explain the same many things, that it's a difficult place to live there with many of the controls, and they always tell about like horror stories about their family members being what you call interrogated, sent to that jail where they were taken out and were thought that they're going to be shot in the middle of like that. And I read also other accounts like Rosewater. If you heard of that book?
Of course. Not only have I heard of that book, he Maziar Bahari, who that's his life story, is kind of my boss. I mean, I write for Iran.
Okay.
Yeah. I read the whole book. Like
I've read the book, actually. I haven't still seen the film. Don't tell the boss, but I haven't seen the film.
I have not seen the film, but I read the book, and he mentions of like the difficult situation of his family going through all of that, and his emotional like torment of wanting to stay true to things while having a guy who smelled like rosewater beating him almost to death a couple of times. And
exactly. I put Iran wire. Oh, I can't enter the chat. Oh.
Yeah, you can type.
Sorry.
Sure. Sorry.
Anyway, I couldn't do it. It's complicated because I'm not like whatever. Anyways, but if someone puts iranwire.com, that's the website that Maziar runs, and it has yeah. Very interesting content.
We had another content creator.
So I gotta go. I gotta go at a few minutes.
Yes.
Because my girlfriend is not very amused with how long this has
I
taken.
got you.
She's already
Yeah.
going, yeah, I know
understand.
you're famous,
Same
but I
deal.
want dinner. I've got to eat first, right? That's right. We
Yes.
would like to thank your girlfriend for allowing you this time, first of all. And we're sure
She's listening, I believe, in
She's
the
very
other room.
generous.
she's watching her watch. She's looking at her watch and listening. And clue. Um. Okay,
So
so
thank you so
everyone.
much.
Oh yeah, thank you.
Yes, go on.
For the chat, we have special guests frequently on this channel. Here's the spiel. We have special guests frequently on this channel, but only if they can speak from experience and they're actually directly involved instead of talking about. We were very, very lucky that Professor Azizi at 2:30 in the morning agreed 2 days ago. Very, very lucky. Those of you who have missed the talk, please watch the VOD. He's given us some recommendations and asked us to take some actions that we can actually take to be involved and to be positive for this. This is why this was so important. It's not the end of the world. We don't have to get doomer. He's given us a whole new positive perspective. So please watch the VOD, take his considerations into action. There's things we can do, folks. We don't have to sit here and be up for the third night in a row. For me, four nights in a row. Ever since it started on Monday, no sleep. So, Professor Azizi, thank you so much. We have your Twitter up. We actually hope to see you again. Anytime you want to
Definitely, I'd
come
love
by.
to.
Anytime you want to come by, and anybody you'd like to bring, I will be happy to host you on the quote virtual couch that we have here. Um, these are your students, in a way, and
We're,
we don't
we're,
want to
all-
keep you.
we're learning from each other.
We learn from each
So
other.
thank you, Macaulay, and thank you, Socrates, and thank you, Vic, and thank you, Dan, and I hope to see you guys all soon again.
Anytime you
Thank
want,
you.
come
That would
in
be awesome.
and come
Yeah,
in.
thank you
Please
so
come
much for
back.
being here.
For talking. That's amazing.
Appreciate
How do you say
Okay.
we say in Cree, Kitwam Kwapamitten. We'll see each other again for alive and well. Chaosco and peace. How do you say that in Persian?
Well, let's go with the goodbye for now, which is
Try that.
goodbye in Persian is beautiful. Yeah, in Persian, goodbye is beautiful. It means it says sort of shall God keep you, which sort of it's very. So we say Khoda Hafiz.
Khoda
Khoda
Hafiz.
Hafiz.
Khoda Hafiz.
Khoda
Oh, that
Hafiz.
is beautiful.
Khoda.
And may God keep us all. Thank you so much and good night.
Beautiful. Thank you,
Night.
and
Good
thank you for the
night.
beautiful.
Au revoir.
Bye bye.
Khuda Hafiz.